Okay, so in part two of this week's lecture, I'm going to talk about some sociological themes where I'm going to go through structure and agency a little bit more detail and then talk about some specific sociological concepts. So as I said in part one, sociology is kind of founded on traditions of criticism, where sociologists tend to look at the world from a critical perspective, investigate social problems, do research on those problems, come up with some findings about what's going on, and then often make suggestions about how to fix this problem, how to make things better. So sociological research in that sense can have influence on policy formulations and all that kind of stuff. Research is done, as I said in the first part as well, through various methodologies, quantitative and qual and all those kind of stuff. So research is, I think, just well worth doing for an end in itself, just to produce knowledge and understanding of the world. But again, importantly, it becomes valuable when it has impact in policy as well. So we have this kind of critical disposition towards the world, do research on it, see who benefits, how we can make things better. And then from those, some sociologists extrapolate theories and concepts out of those findings to try and create, I suppose, more general understandings of the world, and to use those theories to maybe think about doing other research projects or think about, other social problems. So theory is really important for for understanding the social world. And theories aren't just kind of thoughts or things on paper. Theories and concepts actually have really impact in the world. Democracy is a theory or a concept in a way, and becomes a way to organise society. Economic rationalism or neoliberalism are kind of dominant theories in economics, and they're the economics that kind of dominate our world. But they're not the only theories, and within that field, there's debates going on about whether that's the best economics or not. One of the questions we often get in this course about theories is why the kind of term's so complex, and theoretical writing can be quite difficult to understand. But there's a few reasons for this. Firstly, that in a way, language is part of the problem in the world. Language is full of embedded inequalities that we'll talk about later in the course. So to just use that language uncritically can see the risk of replicating those inequalities. Secondly, one of the reasons that theoretical and social theory is so complex is that societies are really complex. What I always find interesting about this is that, as a layperson, we don't really expect to understand, say, theoretical physics. It's seen as really difficult. Why? Because they're looking at really complex things, either, tiny things or really massive things, the way that kind of a whole bunch of things really interact. And so, for the most part, as people aren't trained in those kind of sciences, we don't really expect to understand the theoretical language of those fields. What's interesting about sociology is that because we all live in society, I think we therefore develop a bit of an understanding that we should be able to kind of understand this kind of theories about society because we all have an experience of it. So, but really, societies are kind of as or even more complex than, the things that, physics, chemistry, or biology study. So we need to come up with kind of, complex theoretical apparatus to understand, those relations. So the difficulty there is a bit of an issue in terms of learning sometimes, but investing yourself in that difficulty and will be really satisfying, and I think can, as I've said before, be quite life-changing in terms of your understanding of things. I mentioned earlier on the idea of structure and agency and the tensions between those things, where structures pertain to the various cultural institutions, the inequalities and norms in societies that cultures produce, that kind of mostly constrain our agency, how free we are to act. I did mention too that structures aren't always negative, though, that they do provide us with freedoms as well. So what we're kind of interested in there in looking at, I suppose, from a sociological perspective is how our choices can be put into practice. What stops us, or what enables us to, live the life that we want to live. So it's important to remember that the idea of choice here is often kind of associated with freedom, but really we need to kind of critically analyse that idea of freedom. How much freedom do individuals in our society or other societies or just generally have? So sociology shows that we're all free to make decisions about our lives and trying to do stuff, and that relates to our agency, but we certainly cannot make those decisions outside of social structures and social influences and institutions. So a key sociological question here is how free we are to act. And I suppose when I'm normally doing this in a lecture theatre, I kind of get everyone to think about, what the hell are you doing there? Like, did you actually choose to come here today, to sit here in this lecture theatre, or in your case, sit in front of a computer or listen to this in your headphones? How free are you to choose this? I would say that most of you would prefer to be at the beach or the pub or whatever, right? But you're choosing to do this to make yourself better, to get the education that you need, to get the job you want, and to have the life that you want, to be able to buy the things you want, to make yourself more attractive to a partner or whatever. So this really problematizes the idea of choice. I would argue that most of us wouldn't go to work if we didn't have to, even though, you hear lotto winners when they win the $30 million to say they'll go back to work. I think that can be a really good example of the way that ideology works. Again, a concept that we'll look at later in the course. But not only are those choices to, say, participate in higher education about your day-to-day life and whether you prefer to be there or not, we need to think more broadly, more structurally about who can go to university and why. And also, I suppose, even the fact that you may get into university may be a progress or help you do the things you want to do, but then there's inequalities in those systems as well, where, say, a degree from the University of Newcastle won't have as much status as that from Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard. And could you go to those universities if you choose to or you wanted to? Well, probably not, right? So this is the kind of tensions in that example just about attending universities, multiple kind of levels of structured agency going on there. There's your day-to-day life, whether you choose to get out of bed and come to university or not, and what are the kind of overarching constraints and thoughts about to do that or not. Is it going to prolong your degree if you fail a course? All that kind of stuff. But then there's the broader kind of structural aspects about the education system itself. Again, we'll look at that stuff in quite some detail throughout the course. Overall, most contemporary sociologists don't necessarily say it's all about structure or all about agency. There are still some that kind of talk about the kind of voluntarism that we can largely do what we want to do, or structural determinism that we're largely born into the world and that's therefore the way that we're going to turn out and we have very little choice beyond that. Most sociologists these days kind of see the tension between those things and lie somewhere in the middle of those kind of structure agency debates. In this sense, we're all operating within social structures. We're strongly influenced by the environment around us, and social structures both shape us in terms of our socialisation, that I'll talk about in the fourth part of the lecture today, but individual actions also shape social structures, and this is how social change happens. So again, there's a constant tension between social change and social kind of stasis, the way things stay the same. So while we're born into the world within these social structures and we can't operate without them, we're not kind of passive, kind of puppet-like figures within that. We have agency to invest, some of us more than others, to make the world in our own image. Okay, so in terms of the tension between structure and agency, now I'll talk about some kind of key sociological themes where I can kind of draw that tension out more, I suppose. We'll be looking at class, gender and sexuality, race and ethnicity, and then the fourth one, and we'll do weeks in the course on all of those topics. And then the fourth one is the kind of theme of power, which again is a kind of concept that we'll need to understand to kind of think through most of the course. Okay, so the first thing is class, and class is the area that I'm most interested in terms of my research. And we can look at class in a number of different ways. We can look at the economic position of individuals and groups, how much money you have, how much stuff you own, and that kind of means you're either in a kind of ruling class or a middle class or a working class, and we can break those up into kind of even smaller demographics. But I suppose there's an economic understanding of class, and then there's a more cultural and symbolic understanding of class, and this is where the idea of status comes into play. So not only class relations broken up in terms of how much money you've got, but there's also in terms of like the split between white collar and blue collar work, for instance. white collar work tends to have higher status than blue collar work. Even though I would argue, for instance, that the people that come and pick up the garbage are much more important to society than, say, lawyers. So here, occupations are heavily embedded in our class system, and they relate to status. Another ways we can think about class is like around taste and morals. Who gets to decide what's tasteful? Who gets to decide what's moral? It tends to be people in middle class professions, doctors, politicians, academics, priests, all these kind of people are the ones that kind of have the kind of power in the world to say what's good and bad, what's right and wrong, what's immoral and moral, all these kind of things. So again, class power becomes a way of making the world, of making norms, and has a heavy influence on our cultures and the way that we think and feel in day-to-day life. So we'll be looking at aspects of that in a couple of weeks' time. We do a whole week on class. Class is a key sociological concept, and it's obviously a kind of very much an important concept to think about those relations between structures and agency. The second key sociological theme is gender, and I'm going to talk about sexuality here as well, but like sexuality and gender shouldn't be thought of the same thing. They're different, definitely different categories. One of the ways that gender is often taught is between nature and culture, biology, nature and nurture. Sorry, the relationship between biology and culture. How much is the fact that we're born as a particular sex affect the way that we kind of perform ourselves in the world? From a sociological perspective, we tend to look at the way that gender is socialized. From early ages, we give boys blue stuff, blue clothes, girls pink clothes. We give boys, trucks and cars, and girls Barbies. And this kind of reproduces those kind of gender performances. So we'll look at that in some detail in the coming weeks. A really interesting thing that spun me out when I first heard about it is that even babies, newborn babies, are treated different by people that pick them up. If they know they're a boy, they'll treat them more roughly. If they know they're a girl, they're likely to be more gentle with them. So these things are kind of happening almost from the moment of born, and there's even research that shows how this kind of socialization practices happen before the baby's born as well. From a more structural perspective, we can think about pay systems. Women are still paid way less than men doing the same stuff. Even in households where men and women, husband and wife are doing kind of same kind of professional kind of work, the woman will be the one that will take on most of the housework and the kids. Things like casualisation tend to affect women in much more negative ways than men. So we'll be looking at that in some detail as well. We'll also be looking at the notion of sexuality in that week as well, how we'll be looking at sexuality across a spectrum and why some forms of sexualities are seen as normant and others are kind of often defined as deviant. We'll also be thinking about these in more kind of public stuff. I've already spoken about the socialisation of like Tonka trucks and Barbie toys, but like in more contemporary times, we can think of things like, the rise of metrosexuality and, what does things like anorexia and fitness obsessions and stuff like that say about gender. So again, gender relates to notions of structures and agency, how various norms and rules and inequalities affect individual lives based on whether, you're male or female or what gender you are. Third really important key sociological theme is race and ethnicity. Now, it needs to be spelled out straight away. These are two different things. Again, we'll do a whole week on this later in the course. Race tends to be a more scientific category, ethnicity a more kind of cultural category. Increasingly, from even a genomic scientific perspective, we have an understanding that race, in the way that we publicly understand it anyway, doesn't really exist. There's often more differences within so-called races than between them. But despite the fact that race as a scientific category is increasingly seen as being problematic, those categories of race still have a real influence on the way that we live and the way that we relate to each other and the way that inequalities and discriminations and marginalisations function. So we'll look at different kinds of racism between the scientific and the more cultural racism. In the weeks on globalisation, we'll start thinking about how these race relations and global relations affect who can move around the world freely and who can't. and particularly in notions of in the experiences of migrants and refugees. We'll even be thinking, in a way that I think for many students should make the normal look strange, is to think about what it means to be an Australian. There's all these kind of stereotypes about, whether it's the bush and Barbies or whether it's the beach and cricket or whatever, but really many Australians and many white Australians don't even really relate to those things. So we'll think about the way the stereotypes create these kind of norms, and then, we expect people to come to the country and assimilate to those things when really they don't really exist or aren't that accurate anyway. We'll be lucky enough to have Kath Butler to come for a whole week and talk about the Indigenous perspectives in sociology, and the health problems here. And one of the things that Kathy will do in that lecture is actually do an Indigenous critique of many of the traditions of sociology, which I think is a really important thing to bring into the course. And we also do a whole week on globalization as well. So how these kind of the ways that more and more people are moving around the world, more and more people are exposed to other cultures through media and stuff like that, and how this is kind of related to the way that we live and the way that we think about each other. And the last one, we don't do a whole week on power, but this is kind of a concept that's important to think about in the course. Power is conceived in many different ways from different sociological perspectives. I suppose the more kind of everyday understanding is that power is a top-down thing. Some people have lots of it, some people don't have much. That's certainly a very vital understanding of the way the power works. But in more complex ways we can think about, is power something you can actually possess? Or is it more related to the things you have? Does having lots of money mean you have power? But then, maybe if a really rich person goes into a particularly social situation, they may, feel like they're going to get beat up or something. So who has the power in that situation? So power in that sense is kind of contextual. There's no doubt that those with, the 1% billionaires have more power and more kind of freedom from many of the problems of society. So we'll think about when that kind of power is legitimate and when it's not. Is it top down? Does money equal power? Does knowledge equal power? Does being a white male equal power? One of the more recent ways to think about power is it's actually embedded in everyday life, and it's even embedded in, say, the ways that the streets are organised or the way that, say, a lecture theatre is organised. If you imagine the lecture theatre, which you would normally be sitting in this course, but the students are kind of in all those uncomfortable seats in like a grandstand in a way. The person out the front has a lectern that they stand in front of that denotes that they're the speaker, they're the important one. People come in, face the front, tend to keep quiet and behave. The lecturer out the front, who's the designated expert from the power of the institution, pontificates about their expertise. In that situation, the architecture of space sets up a power situation. The proximity of that space within a university gives one person, the lecturer, more power over the students, in the sense that they look after your marks and, have all that kind of stuff. But really, that power only exists in that space. Well, it exists in other spaces as well, but like in terms of social relations, the relation between lecturer and student doesn't exist, say, if it's on like a sporting field, or if we were never to meet in a lecture situation and meet at a pub or in a social situation. The legitimation of my power in the course is given to me by the architecture of social space and also my position within that institution that doesn't really exist in terms of those relations outside of it. So power in that sense is more complex in terms of something that I may have in this situation, but not so much in other situations. So just to unpack that stuff a little bit, I'll just kind of relate all these themes a little bit to some of the work that I've been doing on Hipsters and Bogans over the years. And there's a link to a radio show that I did there on that, and it's also in the Everyday Struggles book. You can think about these relations between class, gender and sexuality, race and ethnicity and power through the idea of self-identity and social identity. Self-identity is kind of the way that you think of yourself in the world, the way that you want to present yourself, and it's related obviously to the way that we're socialised and the way that you want to kind of have other people think of you. Social identity, though, is the way that other people think of you and also the way that you think of other people. So Hipsters and Bogans is a good way of thinking about this stuff. If you call someone a hipster, you're actually using here the language of class, because hipster tends to relate to kind of middle class practices. If you're using the label of bogan, here you tend to be kind of relating to more kind of what's seen as vulgar working class practices. So in everyday language, and this is what I was relating to before when I was talking about language, these terminologies mean specific things that like actually are class categories, but really class relations and the understanding of class are kind of removed to the background when we use those labels, and we just kind of use them as kind of stereotypes, often to label people that aren't like us and to kind of denigrate them in many ways. So if you're interested in that, have a listen to that that radio show there, or you can check out some of my work on that. Okay, I'll leave it there and then move on to the next section.